Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are tackling an event so massive, so incredibly world-altering, that its impact is still felt everywhere today. I'm talking, of course, about World War I. Now, you probably already know the basic timeline, right? 1914 to 1918. But today, we're going to dig into exactly how a highly localized regional dispute cascaded into this absolute beast of a global conflict. We're going to see how it swallowed the entire globe, completely obliterated ancient empires, and literally redrew the map of the modern world. Let's get right into it.
So think about this for a second. How does one single gunshot change human history forever? It's just a staggering concept to wrap your head around. Because back in 1914, this solitary, incredibly isolated moment ended up plunging the entire world into one of the most deadly conflicts we have ever recorded. But to really grasp how a single spark could burn down centuries-old empires, we first need to understand the incredibly volatile environment that allowed that fire to catch in the first place.
Which brings us to Act 1, the European powder keg. Okay, so picture Europe at the dawn of the 20th century. It wasn't at peace. At all. It was basically consumed by total paranoia. You've got these incredibly powerful nations locked in fierce competition. A great way to remember the underlying causes here is the acronym MAIN. That stands for militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Think of these four factors as tightly packed gunpowder. They created this super tense atmosphere of rivalry where literally any tiny dispute was going to trigger a massive explosion.
And the final piece of that puzzle? The alliance system. It cleanly, but super dangerously, split the entire continent right in two. On one side, you have the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other side, the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia. Now here is a wild fact. The monarchs of Britain, Germany, and Russia, they were actually all first cousins. Crazy, right? But because of these incredibly rigid mutual defense pacts, they were locked in. Attacking one meant attacking them all. The ultimate absolute worst-case scenario domino effect.
And that sets the stage for Act 2, the spark in Sarajevo. Picture the bustling streets of Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is visiting in an open-top car. Suddenly, he and his wife are assassinated by a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. This right here, this was the gunshot that changed the world. Just 1 month later, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. And because of those rigid alliance systems we just talked about, what started as a regional dispute instantaneously yanked in all the major powers. Boom, full-blown global war.
Now we enter Act 3, the brutal new war.
So at first, Germany initiates this rapid sweep right through Belgium. They're hoping to crush France in a quick, decisive victory. But actually, it didn't go down like that. The conflict ground to a horrifying, absolute halt. It morphed into a brutal war of attrition, fought in these incredibly muddy, awful trenches. Millions of young soldiers were trapped in these wretched scars in the earth. They were subjected to deafening, endless artillery shelling, rampant disease, extreme weather, and just sheer hunger. It was literally an industrialized meat grinder. And on top of that, this war completely revolutionized modern combat. It introduced some absolutely terrifying new technologies to the battlefield. For the first time, you had skies filled with fighter aircraft and aerial dogfights. The ground was literally shaking with these new armored tanks and rapid-fire machine guns. You had stealthy submarines prowling the oceans, and the trenches themselves were filled with the horrific devastation of poison gas. So yeah, innovation accelerated at warp speed, but it completely industrialized the scale of death, making this the most destructive conflict in human history up to that point.
Let's move on to Act 4, America enters the fight.
Now, initially, the United States was like, hey, we are staying out of this. They maintained a strict policy of neutrality. But an undeniable chain of provocations eventually forced their hand. First off, Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare led to the tragic sinking of civilian ships, like the RMS Lusitania, which totally outraged the American public. Then came the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, which was basically Germany proposing a secret alliance with Mexico. That spiked tensions to an absolute breaking point. So by 1917, the United States officially enters the war, bringing in fresh troops and massive resources that completely shifted the momentum.
And that shifting momentum proved to be totally insurmountable. By late 1918, Germany's military was just entirely depleted, and its economy was in total ruin. Facing inevitable defeat, Germany had no choice but to agree to an armistice. So on November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent.
Over 4 years of absolutely unprecedented global upheaval had come to a close.
Which brings us to our final chapter, Act 5, The Cost of Peace. 20 million. I really want you to let that number sink in for a moment. Think back to how this whole thing began, the intimacy of just one single gunshot in Sarajevo. Contrast that isolated moment with this incredibly staggering reality. More than 20 million soldiers and civilians were killed or wounded. It's a scale of human loss that is honestly almost impossible to fully comprehend. And it all cascaded from that one single spark.
And beyond that immense human tragedy, the global political map was altered forever. 4 deeply entrenched historical empires collapsed completely. The German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the Russian empires. Poof, gone. Centuries of dynastic rule and established borders were literally wiped away almost overnight. The entire old global order was torn down right to its foundations.
So, what happened next? Well, in 1919, the victorious nations drafted the Treaty of Versailles to try and rebuild that order. But this treaty imposed incredibly harsh financial and territorial penalties on Germany. The goal wasn't just to end the fighting, it was to permanently reshape political systems and, theoretically at least, ensure that a conflict of this magnitude could never ever happen again. It was supposed to be the war to end all wars.
But that leads us to a really dark and compelling final question. Did the harsh penalties of the Treaty of Versailles actually pave the way for the rise of Adolf Hitler and World War II? A lot of historians argue that the crushing, humiliating conditions of this peace treaty created the exact resentful environment needed for extremism to take root in Germany. So while World War I reshaped modern history, its resolution might have tragically planted the seeds for an even more devastating conflict. It really leaves you wondering, are we always doomed to repeat the mistakes of our past resolutions? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world today. I'll catch you next time.